The rain in Itaewon doesn't just fall, it drowns. Jasmine Carter's sneakers are soaked through, her cardigan heavy with the scent of wet asphalt and wilted carnations. She's dragging a man twice her size into the shadows of a narrow alley, his blood staining her palms a terrifying crimson. He is a mess of shredded silk and jagged wounds, a dragon tattoo snaking up a neck that feels fever-hot beneath her touch. "Stay with me," she whispers, a frantic prayer of English and broken Korean. "Gwenchana, you're gonna be okay." Through the haze of drugs and pain, Kang Tae-hyun looks up. He doesn't see a witness. He sees a vision with skin like polished mahogany and eyes full of a mercy he hasn't earned. He is the king of Gangnam's underworld, but tonight he is just a dying man saved by a woman the world ignores. Thank you for watching, my loves. If you believe love can find light in the darkest places, hit that subscribe button. Tell me in the comments, would you have stopped to help? Let's see where you're watching from. The air in the rooftop Gosiwon was thick with the scent of cheap ramyeon and the sharp, clinical sting of antiseptic. Jasmine sat on the floor, her back against the mini-fridge that hummed like a dying cicada. On her narrow bed, the man lay like a fallen god, his presence consuming the few square meters she called home. Even in a drug-induced stupor, Kang Tae-hyun radiated a predatory stillness. The dragon tattoo on his neck, a masterpiece of ink and scar tissue, seemed to writhe under the flickering fluorescent light. Her hands shook as she opened her battered laptop. She didn't have much, just the memory of the expensive watch she'd tucked into her drawer for safety, and the way the shadows in the alley had seemed to flee from him. She typed descriptions into a search engine, her Korean failing her until she switched to English forums for expats and news archives. The search results hit her like a physical blow. Kangpa Syndicate, the dragon's reign over Gangnam. Internal war, heir to the Kang Empire targeted in failed assassination. The photos were grainier, but the man was unmistakable. This wasn't a businessman or a victim of a random mugging. This was the king of the underworld, a man whose name was whispered with a mix of reverence and terror in the very streets where she sold carnations. He was responsible for the gambling dens, the protection rackets, and perhaps even the very loan sharks who had been breathing down her neck since her father's funeral. Jasmine looked from the screen to the man on her bed. His face was surprisingly peaceful in sleep, devoid of the coldness described in the articles. She should call the police. She should run. But as she looked at her own hands, still stained with the ghost of his blood, a dark, terrifying realization took root. She had saved a monster. And in the world of the Kangpa, a life debt was never just a thank you. It was a tether. If his enemies found out she had him, she was dead. If he woke up and saw her as a witness, she might be worse than dead. Yet, when he stirred, groaning in the dark, she didn't flee. She reached for the water, caught in the gravity of a man who was about to pull her entire world into the abyss. The silence of the room was broken by a sharp, ragged intake of breath. Jasmine froze, her hand hovering over a bowl of steamless ramyeon. On the bed, Kang Tae-hyun's eyes snapped open. They weren't the eyes of a victim. They were dark, predatory, and instantly calculating. In one fluid, agonizing motion, he sat up, his hand darting to his waist where a holster should have been. Finding only the soft cotton of an oversized t-shirt Jasmine had found in her father's old trunk, his expression shifted from lethal intent to profound confusion. He looked at the mold blossoming in the corners of the ceiling, the stack of unpaid bills on the small desk, and then at Jasmine. To Tae-hyun, this wasn't just poverty. It was a gilded cage of squalor. "Nuguya," he rasped, his voice like grinding stones. "Who are you?" Jasmine swallowed hard, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. I I found you in the alley. You were bleeding. She struggled to find the Korean words for drugged and poison, settling for a frantic gesture toward his arm. Hospital. You needed a hospital, but people were looking for you. Tae-hyun's gaze dropped to his bandaged wounds. They were wrapped with a precision that spoke of care, not just necessity. He looked at the black woman standing before him, her hair pulled back in neat braids, her eyes wide with a terrifying mixture of courage and exhaustion. He recognized the scent now. Carnations and cheap soap. "You shouldn't have touched me," he said, his Korean formal but cold. He stood up, swaying as the remnants of the toxin clawed at his brain. He reached for his silk trousers draped over a chair and pulled a roll of wet, blood-stained bills from the pocket, tossing them onto her bed. It was more money than Jasmine had seen in a year. "Keep it, forget my face," he commanded. He walked to the door, his hand pausing on the frame. He looked back at her, a visible outsider in a country that demanded invisibility. For a moment, the cold mask slipped, revealing the man who had almost died in the dirt. Then he was gone, leaving only the scent of expensive tobacco and the horrifying truth that Jasmine's life was no longer her own. 3 days later, the humidity in Itaewon felt like a wet wool blanket. Jasmine stood behind her flower cart, her fingers trembling as she arranged a bouquet of baby's breath. The money Tae-hyun had left sat untouched under her floorboards. It felt like cursed gold, a down payment on a tragedy she wasn't ready to star in. The peace shattered when a black sedan screeched to a halt, mounting the curb. 2 men in cheap tracksuits, Choi Dong-wook's low-level debt collectors, stepped out, their eyes gleaming with predatory boredom. "Jasmine, see," the leader sneered, kicking the wheel of her cart. "The interest on your father's debt just doubled. 50 million won doesn't pay itself back with carnations." He grabbed a handful of roses, crushing the delicate petals in his fist until the red juice ran like blood between his knuckles. "Maybe we take you instead. A black girl like you would fetch a high price in the special clubs." He reached for her arm, but a shadow fell over the pavement. A hand encased in a glove of buttery black leather caught the collector's wrist. The sound of bone snapping was as dry and clinical as a breaking twig. Kang Tae-hyun stood there, looking less like a man and more like an omen. He wore a charcoal suit that cost more than the apartment building behind them. Behind him, 4 men in black formed a silent, impenetrable wall. "She is under my protection," Tae-hyun said, his voice a low, vibrating hum that made the air feel thin. He didn't even look at the screaming collector. His eyes were locked on Jasmine's pale face. He stepped closer, ignoring the chaos as his men dragged the loan sharks into the sedan. He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a file. "Your father, Samuel Carter. Army veteran, your brother, Marcus, in Detroit. You owe the Viper faction 50 million won." He leaned in, the scent of sandalwood and cold iron enveloping her. "I will erase the debt. I will provide a house, a car, and safety. In exchange, you will stay where I can see you. You saved my life, Jasmine. Now, I am claiming yours." Would you have taken the offer? Hit like if you think you'd be strong enough to walk away. The interior of the Maybach was a sensory overload of hand-stitched leather and the hushed, artificial chill of high-end climate control. Jasmine sat as far from Tae-hyun as the seat allowed, her hands knotted in her lap. Outside the tinted windows, the familiar, gritty streets of Itaewon blurred into the sleek, neon-drenched arteries of Gangnam. She felt like a specimen preserved in glass, a butterfly pinned to a velvet board. "I didn't ask for this," Jasmine said, her voice trembling but clear. I saved a man, not a contract. I don't want your house. I don't want to be your… whatever this is. Tae-hyun didn't move, but the air in the car seemed to tighten. He was looking at her reflection in the glass rather than at her directly. In my world, Jasmine, kindness is a currency. You spent yours on me when I was worth nothing. Now, I am paying interest. It wasn't a transaction, she snapped, turning to face him. Her Detroit roots flared, a sharp contrast to the silent, submissive atmosphere his men cultivated. I helped you because you were dying. I would have done it for anyone. At that, Tae-hyun finally looked at her. The cold, mechanical mask of the Kang Pa boss cracked, just for a second. There was a hollow look in his eyes, a deep-seated exhaustion that no amount of money could fix. He reached out, his fingers stopping just short of her cheek, hovering in the space between them. That is exactly why you are in this car, he whispered. Everyone in this city looks at me and sees a throne or a target. You saw a pulse. You're the only person in 10 years who hasn't tried to calculate what my life was worth before saving it. He pulled back, his hand clenching into a fist. For a fleeting moment, she saw the boy who had inherited a crown of thorns, a man drowning in a sea of blood and loyalty, reaching for the only thing that felt real. Her. The elevator ascended in a silence so absolute it felt surgical, a pressurized vacuum that stripped away the noise of the Seoul streets. When the doors slid open, Jasmine stepped into a world that felt like a fever dream of obsidian and gold. Tae-hyun's penthouse wasn't a home, it was a fortress masquerading as a museum. Floor-to-ceiling glass offered a panoramic view of a city that looked like a circuit board of neon lights, all of it seemingly bowing to the man beside her. "This is your room," Tae-hyun said, gesturing toward a suite larger than her entire Gosseon. The luxury was suffocating. There were silk robes, skincare sets worth more than her monthly rent, and a closet filled with clothes in her exact size. A terrifying reminder of how thoroughly he had already dissected her life. But beneath the scent of expensive lilies there was a metallic tang she couldn't ignore. In the hallway, silent men with coiled muscles and hidden holsters stood like statues. She watched through, a half-open door as one man was brought in, his face a map of bruises, kneeling before a desk while Tae-hyun's younger cousin, Yoon Ji-hoon, looked on with chilling indifference. Ji-hoon stepped out, his suit immaculate, his eyes scanning Jasmine with a cosmopolitan coldness. Having studied at UCLA, his English was perfect, but his tone was laced with a poison she recognized instantly. "The savior," Ji-hoon remarked, his gaze lingering on her protective braids. "My cousin has a flair for the dramatic, but bringing a Waegukin into the inner circle, especially one who stands out like you do, it's a security nightmare." "She stays," Tae-hyun's voice boomed from behind her, a finality in his tone that silenced the room. That night, Jasmine sat on the edge of a bed that felt like a cloud, looking at a diamond necklace Tae-hyun had left on the vanity. To take it was to accept his protection. To wear it was to become an accomplice to the blood that paid for it. She reached out, her fingers brushing the cold stone, making her first silent compromise in a world where the light never reached the floor. The Gilded Dragon was a subterranean playground where the air tasted of oud wood and illegal wagers. Jasmine stood in the VIP lounge, her skin crawling under the weight of a $1,000 silk dress that felt like a shroud. This was the heart of Tae-hyun's empire, a place where fortunes were bled dry over baccarat tables and the law stopped at the velvet rope. "Stay close," Tae-hyun murmured, his hand a warm, heavy weight on the small of her back. He was greeting politicians and celebrities, his Korean flawless and terrifyingly polite. To them, he was a pillar of industry. To Jasmine, he was the man who had groaned in pain on her floor. The illusion of civility shattered when a frantic server whispered in Tae-hyun's ear. He didn't hesitate. He moved toward the back offices, pulling Jasmine with him. Inside, a man sat tied to a chair, blood dripping onto a pristine white rug. It was one of the loan sharks from the alley, the one who had threatened to sell her. He was the one who drugged you, Ji-hoon said, leaning against the doorframe, idly playing with a flick knife. He works for the Vipers. He knows their next move. Tae-hyun's face transformed. The Sejangnim mask fell, replaced by something ancient and hollow. He picked up a heavy glass decanter. Jasmine's breath hitched. She saw the intent in his eyes, the necessity of violence to maintain the fear that kept him alive. Tae-hyun. Don't, she whispered, her English cracking. He threatened you, Jasmine, Tae-hyun said, his voice smoke over gravel. In my world, a threat to what is mine is a death warrant. Before he could strike, the distant wail of a police siren cut through the club's base. A routine inspection, but if they found a bleeding man in the boss's office, it was over. Ji-hoon looked at Jasmine. You're the American teacher, the innocent. If you tell the officers he's a drunk friend who fell, they'll believe you. They won't even search the room. Jasmine looked at the blood on the floor, then at the man who had saved her from these very monsters. Her conscience screamed, but her hand reached out to grab a cloth, wiping the splatters off the desk. When the officers knocked, she stood in front of the bound man, her heart a frantic drum, and smiled a polite, practiced lie. She had officially traded her soul for his safety. The rain returned that night, drumming against the reinforced glass of the penthouse with a relentless, rhythmic thrum. Jasmine couldn't sleep. The lie she had told the police tasted like copper in her mouth. She wandered the halls until she found a door left ajar, a soft, warm glow spilling into the corridor. It was a private shrine. Kang Tae-hyun was kneeling on the floor, his head bowed before a framed photograph of a stern-faced man, his father, Kang Sung-min. The scent of burning incense and sandalwood hung heavy in the air. Tae-hyun looked smaller here, the weight of the Kangpa Empire visibly bowing his shoulders. He taught me that mercy is a luxury for the dead, Tae-hyun said without turning around. His voice was a low vibration in the quiet room. Jasmine stepped closer, noticing his hands resting on his thighs. His knuckles were split and raw, a testament to the violence he had nearly unleashed in the club. Without a word, she left and returned with a bowl of warm water and a clean cloth. She knelt beside him. The washing ritual was silent and intimate. As she dipped the cloth and pressed it to his skin, she felt him flinch, not from pain, but from the sheer shock of a gentle touch. She wiped the dried blood away, her dark skin a stark, beautiful contrast against his pale, scarred hands. My father was betrayed by his best friend, he whispered, finally meeting her eyes. I watched him die in this very room. Since then, trust has been a ghost I couldn't catch. Until you. He reached out, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. The air between them turned electric, thick with the scent of rain and unspoken promises. Jasmine knew she was standing on the edge of a precipice. To love him was to embrace the monster, to accept the blood on his hands as her own. Yet, when he leaned in, his forehead resting against hers, she didn't pull away. The chemistry is undeniable, but is it worth the cost? Subscribe if you're feeling this tension too. The air in the private wing of the Schiller Hotel was freezing, despite the steaming cups of expensive Omija tea on the table. Madame Kang sat with the posture of a marble statue, her hanbok a deep, regal violet that seemed to absorb the light. She hadn't looked at Jasmine once. Instead, she stared through her, treating the black woman in the room as if she were a piece of furniture that didn't quite fit the decor. Tae-hyun, his mother said, her Korean sharp and formal. The organization is already whispering. You brought a Waegukkin into your home. A woman from the streets of Itaewon. Do you intend to drag your father's legacy through the mud for a fleeting curiosity? Tae-hyun's jaw tightened. He sat beside Jasmine, his hand gripping her thigh beneath the table, a silent anchor. She is not a curiosity, mother. She is the reason I am breathing. Madame Kang finally shifted her gaze to Jasmine. Her eyes were cold, assessing, and filled with a deep-seated prejudice that made Jasmine feel smaller than she ever had in the Gosiwon. She spoke in Korean, her voice a low, melodic poison. You think because you bandaged a wound you belong here? You're a stain on a lineage that goes back generations. You don't speak our language, you don't know our ways, and you look like an intruder. Leave now, and I will ensure you are paid enough to never return to this country. Jasmine felt the familiar sting of isolation. She didn't need a translator to understand the vitriol. She caught the word hyuk-in, black person, and the way it was spat like a curse. She looked at Tae-hyun, who was vibrating with a suppressed fury, and then back at the woman who represented everything that would always reject her. I'm not here for money, Jasmine said in English, her voice steady despite the tremor in her heart. She looked Madame Kang directly in the eyes, breaking the unspoken rule of looking away from elders. I'm here because he needs someone who doesn't see him as a legacy, and I'm not going anywhere. The silence that followed was a glass wall, fragile and ready to shatter. Madame Kang rose, the rustle of her silk sounding like a warning. Then you have chosen your own destruction, she whispered in Korean. Because the vipers are not the only ones who will try to remove you. Jasmine stood by the remains of her old life, the flower cart a skeletal ruin under the flickering streetlights of a side alley in Itaewon. She had gone back for her father's military medals, hidden in the floorboards of the Gosiwon she once called home. Tae-hyun's security detail was supposed to be guarding the perimeter, but the Viper faction moved through the city like a virus, silent, invasive, and lethal. So, this is the Queen of the Kang Empire? Choi Dong-wook stepped out of the shadows, the orange tip of a cigarette glowing like a predatory eye. He was younger than Tae-hyun, his face scarred not by history, but by a manic, unearned ambition. He kicked a fallen bouquet of white lilies, grinding the delicate petals into the oily rainwater. Tae-hyun has lost his mind, Dong-wook sneered, circling her with a slow, shark-like grace. Risking a war for a Waegukkin? A black woman who doesn't even belong in this soil? You're a stain on his reputation. A weakness he's too soft to cut out. He thinks he's protecting his honor, but he's just bringing shame to the bloodline. Before Jasmine could scream, Dong-wook's hand shot out, gripping her throat. He shoved her back against the rough brick wall, the impact rattling her teeth. 2 more men appeared, their faces hidden by masks. They didn't just want information, they wanted to desecrate. They tore into her cart, shattering the wood and trashing the memories of her father, while Dong-wook hissed racist slurs into her ear, mocking her skin and her presence in his city. A heavy blow landed across her jaw, sending her spiraling into the wet pavement. She tasted copper and felt the cold rain mixing with the warmth of her own blood. As Dong-wook raised his boot, the roar of a high-performance engine shattered the night. Tires screamed against the asphalt. Tae-hyun's men arrived too late to stop the first blow, but just in time to witness the carnage. Tae-hyun stepped out of the car before it had even fully stopped. He didn't look at the vipers. He looked at Jasmine, broken and bleeding in the mud, surrounded by the ruins of the only honest thing she had left. The silence that followed was more terrifying than any scream. It was the sound of a man finally letting go of his humanity. The penthouse was no longer a sanctuary, it was a war room. Jasmine sat on the edge of the obsidian bathtub, her face a map of swelling bruises and jagged cuts. Tae-hyun knelt before her, his hands, usually so steady, trembling as he dabbed a cold cloth against her split lip. He didn't speak, but the air around him hummed with a lethal, vibrating frequency. Every time his thumb brushed her skin, he looked like he was the one being burned. "I'm going home, Tae-hyun," she whispered, her voice thick. "Keisha was right. This isn't my world. I'm just a target here." Tae-hyun gripped her wrists, his eyes dark with a desperate, possessive fear. "You are not leaving. I will burn every street in Seoul until they are too afraid to even speak your name." The heavy double doors burst open. Yoon Ji-hoon walked in, his face unusually pale. He didn't look at Jasmine. He looked at his cousin. "Tae-hyun, we have a problem. The Vipers didn't find her by accident. Someone gave them the GPS, coordinates of her old apartment. Someone with access to our internal security bypass." Tae-hyun stood up, the transformation from lover to monster instantaneous. "Who?" Ji-hoon hesitated, casting a quick, conflicted glance at Jasmine. "It was the Elder, your mother's head of security. He believes he's saving the family. He told the Vipers that if they removed the distraction, you would return to your senses. He thought they'd just scare her into leaving the country." The betrayal cut deeper than any blade. It wasn't just a rival gang, it was his own blood, his own legacy, weaponizing the very racism Jasmine faced daily to purify the organization. Tae-hyun's mother had sanctioned this. She had preferred a war with the Vipers over a daughter-in-law who looked like Jasmine. Jasmine felt a cold hollow open up in her chest. She wasn't just an outsider, she was a catalyst for a civil war. As Tae-hyun reached for his gun, his face a mask of cold, calculated murder, she realized the line between right and wrong hadn't just blurred, it had vanished. The night air at the Incheon container terminal tasted of salt and cordite. The Vipers had retreated to the docks, a labyrinth of rusted iron and shadows where they felt safe. They didn't realize that Kang Tae-hyun wasn't coming for a negotiation. He was coming for an exorcism. Jasmine watched from the reinforced back seat of a black SUV as the world erupted in a symphony of violence. This wasn't the cinematic action she'd seen in movies. It was brutal, efficient, and sickeningly quiet. Tae-hyun's men moved like smoke, their silenced weapons spitting flashes of blue light that illuminated the carnage. Tae-hyun was at the center of it, a dark god of vengeance. He didn't hide behind cover. He walked through the fire, his charcoal suit stained with the literal lifeblood of his enemies. He found Choi Dong-wook cornered against a shipping container. There were no words. Tae-hyun didn't ask for an apology for the racist slurs or the bruises on Jasmine's face. He simply took hold of him. Jasmine turned her head away as the sound of the first impact echoed across the water, a wet, heavy thud that signaled the end of Dong-wook's ambition. When Tae-hyun returned to the car 10 minutes later, he was unrecognizable. His knuckles were shredded, and his white shirt was a map of gore. He opened the door and sat beside her, the smell of gunpowder and metallic iron filling the small space. He was shaking, not with fear, but with a lingering, primal adrenaline. "It's done," he rasped, his voice barely a whisper. He reached out to touch her face, but paused, seeing his own crimson-stained fingers. He started to pull back, his expression crumbling into one of profound shame. Jasmine didn't shrink away. She reached out, taking his bloodied hand in hers and pressing it against her cheek. She was crying, her heart breaking for the man he was and the monster he had to be to keep her. In that moment, she accepted the blood price. She wasn't an innocent teacher anymore. She was the partner of a kingpin, and the stains on his hands were now hers to carry. 1 year later, the air on Jeju Island smelled of salt and tangerine blossoms, a sharp, clean contrast to the heavy neon of Seoul. Jasmine stood in the doorway of a small, white-walled flower shop, tucked into a cliffside. Her belly was heavy with their first child, a physical manifestation of a bridge between two worlds that many said should never have met. The organization had fractured. After the massacre at the docks and the public shaming of his mother, Tae-hyun had stepped back from the daily brutality of Gangnam. He wasn't clean. The money that funded this paradise was still stained with the ghosts of the past, but the violence was now a distant thunder rather than a daily storm. Tae-hyun walked up the path, his suit replaced by a simple linen shirt. He carried a crate of fresh peonies, his movements relaxed, but his eyes still habitually scanning the perimeter. He stopped in front of her, leaning down to press a lingering kiss to her forehead. "Your brother's flight from Detroit lands in 3 hours," he said, his English much improved, though still coloured by his deep, gravelly tone. "Ji-hoon is bringing him from the airport." Jasmine smiled, though her heart tightened. Her brother Marcus was horrified by her choice. He didn't see the tenderness in Tae-hyun's eyes. He only saw the headlines and the Korean gangster tag that still followed them in the international media. He didn't understand that for Jasmine, the gilded cage had become a sanctuary. "I have no regrets, Tae-hyun," she whispered, leaning her head against his shoulder. She looked out at the ocean. She was still a black woman in a country that stared, still an outsider in a culture that valued homogeneity above all else. But when she looked at Tae-hyun, she saw the only man who had ever truly seen her. She had chosen the monster to find her home, accepting the darkness for a chance at a love that transcended blood and borders. As the sun set over the Pacific, casting a golden light over their secluded world, she knew the price had been high, but for the first time in her life, she was exactly where she was meant to be. Thank you for watching, my loves. If this story pulled you into the shadows with me, hit like, subscribe, and tell me your thoughts below. Every comment helps this story reach the people who need it. Rest your heart for now, because the next story goes even deeper. And trust me, you won't want to miss what comes next.